We had planned that there would be a sharing of the attention with Councilmember Pinto this evening. She unfortunately is a little bit under the weather, and so you're stuck with just your Attorney General for the evening. But I think we've got some time. I've got some thoughts that I want to share with you. I want to listen, more importantly, and we maybe can wrap up around 7:30 and go down and listen to the Gay Men's Choir, or go home, or get whatever else on our day we can get done. But you know, when I was running for office, I listened for the advice of my father, who was my mentor, who was somebody who I was very close with before he died. And he said, among a lot of wisdom that he shared with me over my life, was that God gives us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. If you go through life listening twice as much as you talk, you do all right. And that was the kind of advice I followed as a father of 3 daughters who are amazing grown women right now, as a husband for the last 30 years. For most of my career practicing law, first at the Justice Department and then in private practice, it was a huge piece of advice to be a candidate for the first time, to be a politician when I never ever thought I'd be in this space of politics. And I really wanted to carry that advice in to being the Attorney General, the second elected Attorney General in the District of Columbia. And so after the election, after the primary election, there was no candidate who ran in the general election, and I was able to start the transition process of getting ready to be the Attorney General really by the middle of August. And so we spent a lot of time being in communities, listening to people throughout the summer and into the fall, and then up through the general election. And then I was able to start my formal transition process under the rules of ethics. I wasn't able to be read into any of the work, the investigations, the work product of the office until after the general election. We had an excellent transition team, great cross-section from across the community, 130 plus people who shared their thoughts with me. They didn't always agree with one another. In fact, you won't be surprised to know that on the most important issues facing our city, there's a lot of vigorous disagreement, and that's okay. Because another good piece of advice I got from my dad is that we can go through life disagreeing without being disagreeable. And in fact, that's one of the things I've encouraged everybody in the Office of Attorney General to be thinking about. I need voices, I need perspectives, not contentiousness for the sake of being contentious, but different points of view to be shared so that we have the benefit of points of view. During the campaign, what I heard from people was, we don't know what the Office of Attorney General does. And so I listened to that, and one of the things we're going to spend some time tonight doing is something I promised, which was I would get out and make sure everybody at the next 4 years knows what your Office of Attorney General does, know who your Attorney General is, know what the office looks like, and know what we can do if you need something, who you call, what kinds of work we do. The second thing that I heard from folks over the course of the campaign and the transition is we want to be much more engaged with the office, that community engagement needs to be a major priority of the office. Why is that? Well, our office is an elected office. We are responsive to the voters and the residents of the District of Columbia, just like the mayor, just like the chair of the council, just like the at-large. The Office of Attorney General, I am elected by a citywide electorate. And to serve the city, you need to be in touch with the city and to be listening to what's happening in the city. The mandate of the office is something that's also responsive to people who live in the city, because we have an obligation to protect the public interest, which is often defined as protecting consumers, protecting seniors, protecting tenants, protecting the environment. And so the only way for the office to really do its work is to be in touch with community. So those were 2 pieces of wisdom that I got along the way that I have immediately put into action as part of our mission going forward in the Office of Attorney General. And I'm delighted that Aaron Jenkins has taken on this massive role of really leaning into what community engagement is going to be like. So we're over the next, hopefully, couple of months going to be in all of the wards. It won't be a one-time thing. This isn't a one-time opportunity for a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation where we will be out, hopefully, letting people know what we do. So I'm looking forward to your questions. I know some of you gave some questions online already, so I have a sense of some of the things that you want to talk about, but I can't promise that I'm going to have answers to anything or everything you ask tonight. We've been in office. I've been in office now since January 2nd. We have made it through our first major milestone, which was our performance oversight hearing which Councilmember Pinto, in her role as chair of the Judiciary Committee, presided over, and that was just last week. So we feel good about having made it through the first milestone, but there's still a lot to learn and a lot to do. So let me just run through a couple of slides and give everybody kind of a sense of what the Office of Attorney General does. Who has our... Okay, there we go. Juan's got it first. So there are 4 priorities for the office under my leadership. These are the 4 sort of organizing principles that we talk about in the Office of Attorney General, all of which are informed by the people who I listened to during the course of the campaign. The first priority is prioritizing public safety and youth development. As many of you know, the Office of Attorney General is responsible for juvenile justice in our city. If you are a young person younger than 18 who's charged with a criminal offense by the MPD, the Office of Attorney General is the prosecutor's office that handles those types of criminal prosecutions. My commitment is not to be a prosecutor whose first interaction with young people is when the MPD may have charged them with a crime. The office needs to be engaged in young people's lives much earlier, because we know that kids who are healthy and hopeful and independent are much less likely to get involved with criminal behavior. They're safer to themselves, they're safer to people around them. When kids don't have the kind of support and structure and space to be healthy and to grow up, that's where they can oftentimes find themselves in trouble with the law. So much of what our office does every day can be organized around how we're helping young people stay healthy, safe, grow up independent, and grow up healthy. The second priority of the office is promoting equity. One of the great strengths of Washington, D.C. is we're a community that is abundant in resource. We have beautiful, beautiful environmental resources with our rivers, with our green space. I learned during the course of this campaign, I'm a third-generation Washingtonian, never knew that, we are the greenest city in North America. And most of the green space in the District of Columbia is in Ward 7. We have absolutely gorgeous green space and rivers that most communities would aspire to have. We have incredible culture, great rich history, restaurants, museums, art scene, music, our cultural scene, sometimes even our sports teams are the eye of everybody's beholden desire, not every season, but some season. So we've got culture, we've got natural resources, we have an abundance in financial resource. All of us who lived here long enough to live through the days when we had a control board and we were broke, to say we have a budget of nearly $20 billion, those words almost don't come off our lips, but that's what our budget has been. Financially, we're awash in money, and probably our most valuable resource is our human talent. We have incredibly smart, gifted people who come to Washington, live in Washington, because they want to commit themselves to policy, law, justice, whatever it might be to make the world a little smarter and better. So when you have all those kinds of resources, you should really have no problems, right? Well, a lot of the problems are that we don't share those resources and the opportunities that those resources offer fairly and equitably across our city. We have too many gaps where some, but not all, of Washingtonians enjoy the benefit of those resources. I believe the law is the single most powerful tool you can have to address the equity gaps in our city, so many of which drive along racial lines given the history of our city and our country. Yep. So promoting equity is something we do every day in the Office of the District of Columbia. That can be through enforcement of our anti-discrimination laws, our housing laws, consumer protection and worker protection are just a few, to name an example of how we try to narrow the gaps in wealth and in income in our city. The third priority is standing up for democratic values. This has been a hot spot over the last several weeks. I'm sure you're all following. What this means is fighting for an autonomous statehood in the District of Columbia, where our voices matter. It also means standing up for the core values that make a rule of law society valuable. It means standing up against hate, against anti-Semitism, white supremacy, homophobia, all of the types of forces that are driving our country to be more and more divisive. All of that finds its way to Washington, D.C. as the nation's capital. And lest anybody think we're immune from that, you just have to look to January 6, 2021 as Exhibit A for why we know all of that anti-democratic venom can find its way here to the District of Columbia. So standing up for core democratic values means something new in light of the Dobbs decision where now all of a sudden, after nearly 50 years, reproductive freedoms and rights are at risk. And we have a new Supreme Court redefining our Second Amendment rights, redefining all kinds of aspects that affect the District of Columbia and the people who live here in very real ways. So those three sort of organizing principles are ones that I sort of define as my external facing principles. The fourth is building the institutional excellence of the Office of Attorney General. So the Office of Attorney General is, I think, the finest District of Columbia government agency that exists in terms of what we deliver. One of the talking points I talked about in the performance oversight was that we return on investment both qualitative and quantitatively better than I think any other agency in the city. Last year, we brought into the District of Columbia, or saved the District of Columbia taxpayers, $600 million in the work we do. Our annual budget's less than $150 million. So you as taxpayers got a $600 million return on a $150 million investment last year from your Office of Attorney General. Not just quantitative, but qualitatively, the work that the Office of Attorney General does is extremely important. We want to be the best law firm in the world. Not the best public interest law firm, the best law firm. And to my point early, we have the talent in this city, extraordinary lawyers, extraordinary professionals, extraordinary policy folks to drive the mission of the Office of Attorney General. But we're an elected office. We were only elected for the second time in 2022. We had one elected Attorney General before that. Prior to that, the Office of Attorney General was appointed by the mayor. And in the early stages, right after the Home Rule Act in 1973, the Office of Attorney General was called the Corporation Counsel, also appointed by the mayor. The name changed in the mid-2000s, but still the appointment of the office was from the mayor. And as you can imagine, there was less of a check and balance when you had the mayor appointing the Office of the Attorney General as opposed to an independently elected Attorney General. 2010, the District of Columbia, through us as voters, decided that one step towards democracy would be to have an elected Attorney General. After a bunch of skirmishing and litigation in 2014, the first election took place. We have to make sure that we build on the excellence of an Office of Attorney General so that people think of the Office of Attorney General like the Justice Department, like the great institutions that protect the rule of law. Beyond politics, always excellent in terms of delivery of great legal advice, great litigation, great counsel, and the work that the taxpayers of the District of Columbia deserve. So we're constantly focused on how do we recruit, retain, train great professionals. How do we make sure that we have policies in place to ensure that we have transparency in what we're doing? How do we engage in the community in a better, more productive way? All of that goes to building the institutional excellence of the office. I see myself as a steward of this great office for as many years as the taxpayers will elect me to be here. It may be 4 years, it may be more, but for whatever it is, it's temporary. The greatness of the office has to live long past the time that I'm the Attorney General. So building a world-class Office of Attorney General is a high priority. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So this is just to give you a little bit of a visual of the work that the office does. We have 9 different divisions that are doing work in the office, and I'm going to run down these so you have a sense just around the horn here. Child support services. So one of the things the Office of Attorney General does is to help families with the financial needs of raising their kids, and this is oftentimes establishing paternity, getting child support orders in place, enforcing child support orders, making sure the money gets to the custodial parent. More importantly, or equally importantly, is working on mediating the relationship between custodial and non-custodial parents. To that first priority I talked about, when kids are caught up in a dynamic where their parents aren't together and they're fighting over the finances, all of that flows down and damages the child. So if we can be in a place where we take out that type of antagonism between custodial and non-custodial parents, we think we're advancing that mission of looking after our kids. We brought in more than $50 million to families in the District of Columbia last year through our child support services. The second is our civil litigation division. This is the division that does all of the defensive litigation for the city. Anytime an agency or the city is sued, the lawyers in the civil litigation division are defending the city. Some of this is tort-type slip and fall cases. Some of it is Second Amendment constitutional challenges to the laws in the District of Columbia. And so a very, very busy office of lawyers, world-class trial lawyers. This group defended I would say conservatively, the ad damnums in the lawsuits against the District of Columbia were probably in the billions, but when we looked at it conservatively, there was probably a realistic exposure of about $450 million of claims against the District of Columbia last year. They were settled either through motions practice, trial, appeal, or settlement for less than $8 million. So that kind of work gets done every day in the Civil Litigation Division. That division also enforces some of the regulatory requirements of the city in terms of causing businesses that owe money to the District of Columbia to pay what they owe. The Commercial Division is, as it sounds, doing the commercial work for the city, eminent domain, tax enforcement, bankruptcy, bond work, giving a lot of advice to different agencies in the District of Columbia that are involved in the business of development, taking property, entering into contracts, and procurement. This division has become much busier in terms of government contract litigation and also in tax enforcement, real estate and other types of tax enforcement in the city. Family Services Division represents the Department of Family Services in abuse and neglect cases. Another place where we're looking after kids in our city, oftentimes having to go into court to, if a child needs to be removed from the home or if there needs to be a foster or adoption process. More often than not, the lawyers are working on how do we make sure we don't have to disrupt families? How do we intervene in situations early enough to protect kids in situations where they may be at harm? The Legal Counsel Division, LCD, is the division of the Office of Attorney General that gives legal advice to other agencies in the government and the council. This is the group of lawyers that assess all proposed legislation for what's called legal sufficiency, an assessment of whether or not a proposed piece of law would violate the Charter, the Constitution, the laws that are in place already. Office of Solicitor General handles all of the appellate work for the office, both in the District Court, the DC Court of Appeals, and in the DC Circuit, but also in the Supreme Court of the United States and in courts all across the country. Almost on a daily basis, we're deciding whether to join amicus briefs in other parts of the country on issues that may have an impact on DC and the DC residents. And where we've been very, very active in this recently is really in the Second Amendment and in reproductive rights. Because while we have a little bit of a different political dynamic than some other states and jurisdictions have that are wrestling with some of these issues, we're very much involved in trying to help other states, state AGs, deal with some of the legal issues that could have ramifications for the people who live in it. Personnel, Labor, and Employment Division handles almost all of the internal government labor and employment work, the collective bargaining, the assessment of employment claims that are brought against the District of Columbia. You won't be surprised to know that many of the people who work in the District of Columbia government sometimes sue the District of Columbia on employment-related or collective bargaining-related issues. And the PLED group, Personnel, Labor, and Employment, handles that type of labor and employment work for the city. Our Public Advocacy Division is the division of the office that is doing the affirmative public advocacy work in the environment, worker protection, tenant protection, consumer protection, senior protection work. The statute that created the Attorney General's office gives us a dual obligation. We have to defend the city and do the law work of the city. We also have to defend the public interest. The statute doesn't define public interest, but common law and tradition tells us that public interest is environmental protection, consumer protection, protecting seniors, protecting tenants, that kind of work. And so that group, the Public Advocacy Division, last year brought in close to $15 million in penalties and recovery. In previous years, much more in the opioid litigation, some of the settlements around opioids, massive amounts of money, as well as injunctive relief against bad actors are being delivered that every day through the Public Advocacy Division. Public Safety Division is the prosecutors in the office. They have some responsibility for juvenile prosecutions, but also some adult misdemeanors. They handle domestic violence and special victims units where you have people who are put at risk every day, and there's a criminal or quasi-criminal prosecution element in the office. And that division works very closely with MPD, works very closely with the U.S. Attorney's Office, works closely with federal law enforcement in bringing actions, bringing investigations, authorizing warrants, doing the kind of day in and day out law enforcement work. And then we have a Support Services Division. This is sort of our internal customer service that handles all of what you might imagine an office of 700 plus people need in terms of supplies and space, IT, finance, HR. So that's what your Attorney General's office looks like. We have an immediate office, which is the office that's sort of the front office, and my Chief of Staff and Senior Counsel, Lauren Haggerty, is here. I have a Chief Deputy. His name is Seth Rosenthal. That's the only other position in the office that is statutorily required. But we have legislative and policy advisors, senior advisors. We have a comms department. My Director of Communications, Jordan Valdez, is here. And of course, you've met Aaron Jenkins, my Director of Community Engagement. So these are folks that are day-to-day looking over the entire mission of the Office of Attorney General, not divided into one of the specific working divisions. Okay, so that's what the AG's office looks like. Let's go to the next slide. I think I've told you this, but if I try to describe to people, and I hope everybody will come out of this meeting saying, if anybody asks you, what does the Office of Attorney General do? You'll have a couple of answers to it. We